Everybody thinks that just because they have two ears, they know how to listen. I ran into my advisor's office. I said, Mr. Patrick, I know what I want to be when I grow up. And she goes, well, God, I hope it's not a DJ. And I was like, no. If I just have this burning question, you said something and I get this burning question, I'm not listening to you anymore, Jerome. I'm done. I checked out, man.
There's a difference between a dream chaser and a dream catcher. Hey, everybody, and welcome to the last episode of the Dream Catchers podcast. I am your host, Jerome, and as usual, I've got my man Matt Halloran in with me today. He's the author of the book, Shut the F Up and Listen, and we are going to talk about this amazing piece of literary work. Because I tell you, when I was going through it, I read it, and in one sentence, I figured out what I could attribute just about 98% of all my success to. So if you've been living as long as I have and you have as many grades as I have, you've seen a lot of stuff. But most of that stuff isn't enlightening. In just one sentence, I figured out what I could attribute my success to. So, Matt, thanks for hanging out with me today and sharing with the listeners the gift of listening, because I think many of us have lost that gift.
Well, I agree, but you had that whole intro, dude. What was the flipping sentence, dude? Are you going to just leave us hanging on what the sentence was?
Well, we're going to reveal it. We're going to reveal it later. We got to get in, but you guys got to hold on, because matter of fact, you better buckle up, buckaroo, and get your notepad out, because Matt's going to give you some jewels today.
Yeah, that's the goal. The goal is to try to teach people that what they're doing is listening to respond. They're not listening to listen. And I know that that sounds hyper simplistic, but the biggest issue is, everybody thinks that just because they have two ears, they know how to listen. It's like any other muscle, behavior, habit. You have to practice it. And what I noticed was there was just a really big lack of any quantifiable, provable, actionable practice for people to go out into the world and really exercise this muscle. And so that actually is kind of the foundation on why I wrote this. But the other one was I had gotten done with a podcast, Jerome, and I think I might have said three sentences in 30 minutes. It was just an amazing guest, just deeply thoughtful and really paced. And we do 30-minute shows, and I got done with the show, and I always ask for feedback, as I have with you when you've been a guest on my show. And he's like, Matt, that was the best podcast I've ever been on. And I was like, damn, dude, I didn't say anything. And so that really was okay. So I'm on to something here. So anyway, those are kind of the philosophical underpinnings on why this book happened.
Now, you casually mentioned being a podcast host, but it's not like you've done 10 of those or even 100 of those. Like, how many podcasts have you been involved with, and how long have you been involved in podcasting?
Well, so I know I've done over 1,000. Actually, preparing for the show, I was going to try to get the exact number, but I wasn't able to do it because I don't track all of the other people's shows that I've been on as well as I should. Personally, from the Top Advisor Marketing Podcast, we've done 500 episodes. With the clients that we've had at Proudmouth, I've probably done another 500 episodes. And then I've probably been on a couple of hundred other people's podcasts. But being behind the microphone is something I wanted to do since I was a little kid. When I was 14 years old, 15 years old, my high school, Jerome, had a radio station, and it was WKDS, and I was Madman Matt Halloran was my radio name. And man, I got off my first episode and I ran into my advisor's office. Her name was Chris Kirkpatrick. And I said, Miss Kirkpatrick, I know what I want to be when I grow up. And she goes, well, God, I hope it's not a DJ. And I was like, no, because, I figured I wanted to do this for a living. And she's like, Matt, it's almost an impossible gig to have. And so I'd always been finding ways to get behind the microphone. And it wasn't because I like hearing myself talk. In fact, you and I have had deep conversations about it. I don't usually listen to myself. I'm hypercritical. I know that. Now, I do take pointers well, and I do take feedback well, but listening to my voice isn't what I love to do. I love asking people questions. That's something that you and I both share, that childlike curiosity of just really having the opportunity to make somebody feel heard when most of us don't feel heard at all.
Holding that space. So is that what you call listen to learn?
So listening to learn is actually a level of openness and receptivity. And this is a problem now more today. My wife retired from teaching, and as she had continued teaching over about 20 years, she had noticed that kids and parents wouldn't give the teachers the opportunity to get through the entire thing. They would interrupt, mostly because they had questions. But part of listening to learn is to really set in your own quietude, for lack of a better description, and fully try to absorb. Because here's the deal, this is the same sort of thing as listen to respond. If I just have this burning question, you said something and I get this burning question, I'm not listening to you anymore, Jerome. I'm done. I checked out, man. So what do I need to do? Well, what I need to do is I need to be quiet. The story that I share in the book um, is actually about when I graduated from college. I got one of 4 paid philosophy internships in the nation for biomedical ethics in a hospital system in Omaha, Nebraska. And we were there to teach physicians and nurses ethical problem solving and communication skills. So, like, literally from the time I graduated from college, studying communication skills and effective communication has been what I have done. And no matter where I've been professionally, learning how to communicate more effectively, learning how to listen, learning how to, because the first law of communication is message sent is not necessarily message received. And we just had this doctor who was screaming at us in the middle of this presentation that my mentor and I were doing, because we were covering a case study of a patient who would not do what the doctor said, which I'm sure this doesn't surprise you, man. That happens all the time. And so doctors, they do not deal with that well because they're freaking doctors, right? Um, and the fun part about it was a whole group. We were doing a lunch and learn. There's a whole group of doctors. And after the guy started yelling at us, because he was actually like yelling at us, and he stormed out. All of the other doctors were just looking around and they were like, oh, he said the stuff out loud that we were all thinking. And it forced them to understand that if they do hold that space, if they do just listen, it's really amazing what you can learn. Because, Jerome, I don't know about, yeah, actually, I do know this about you. Dude, we both know we don't know everything. I mean, we know a lot about some small stuff, but I love going into a conversation with that childlike fascination and curiosity, because I don't know what I'm going to learn from anybody I ask a question to. I just don't want to bowl them over. And that's really the foundation of listen to learn.
Now, I don't think everybody has the same listening type. There's the purpose in listening, but there's also the different types of
Yeah.
listeners. And so there's something interesting in there. It's like skydivers, scuba divers, snorkelers, hang gliders, water skiers. Like, what is that? I mean, are those archetypes or what is it?
I mean, they are technically archetypes, right? And I mean, as you have the archetypes in your assessment, I just wanted to try to give people a very quick guide to understand. And this is more about the depth of listening and the depth of a communicator that you're interacting with, so that you don't. If you're talking to a skydiver, you're not trying to go deep sea diver, because it just doesn't work, right? I mean, you're just not going to get anywhere. They're gonna do what they do, and they're gonna pull that parachute and they're gonna fly away, right? There's not interested in having any depth to conversation whatsoever. And then you've got the hang gliders, right? So the hang gliders are people, and a lot of us are hang gliders, just to be clear. We just love kind of floating in and out of conversation, pretty tangential, not very deep, really like being the observer in conversations. Uh, and I just want to be very clear, there's nothing wrong with any of these types of communicators. We all are these types of communicators in different positions. But hang gliders are people who what ends up happening is you'll ask them a question, and the one that I always like to have people practice is, how are you? Not how are you? How are you? It's a different. I don't know how deep we're going to get into pace, intonation, volume, or those things, but that's a very, very different question. What a hang glider will do, Jerome, is you'll ask them their question, and they'll be like, "Yeah, I'm fine. Things are okay," and then they'll float away. But the cool thing about them is they're going to come back because they just realize that you asked them a question, you were interested in the answer, which most people aren't. And then you've got the water skiers. Now, this is where I'd say 75% of the population is. So they're holding on to a rope being yanked behind a boat really fast in conversation, and they're terrified to let go of what they know in their comfort levels, that rope. Because I've water skied a bunch. I live in Michigan, man. You let go of that rope, you surprise how hard water is. It hurts when you land. And then, after you land, you bob up and you realize, okay, that wasn't that bad. And many people just get right back on the rope. And then you've got the snorkelers. Now, this is what I think podcasters, leaders, salespeople, especially, and business owners really need to focus on. And I'm breaking this rule right now, just to be clear. So what snorkelers do is snorkelers it's on the surface of the water. So they're always looking at depth. They're looking at the depth. They're looking at the coral. They're looking at the pretty fishes. And what they'll do is they'll take a deep breath and they'll take a dive down, right? Now, some people can hold their breath up to 3 minutes. I'm about 2 minutes myself. I just have this weird thing about liking to practice holding my breath. It's also really good for your diaphragm, but whatever, it's a speaker. But what happens is they'll take a deep breath and then they'll go deep. How are you? Well, you know what? Things aren't really great right now. I'm having some problems with my relationship, or man, one of my kids is really struggling right now, or I'm feeling really lost. But what they do is they come back up for air because they realize they can't stay down there as long as they might want. So what they'll do is then they'll come up to the surface and they'll have service conversation. But what's crazy about it, if you hold that space, if you listen, man, they're going to dive again. And the reason I bring this up for salespeople, leaders, and podcasters, that's about how long you should talk. Before you take a break, 2 to 3 minutes.
2 to 3 minutes is a long time.
I know, dude.
It's a long time. But if you're telling a story that's engaging, I think you can do that well. I personally know that I identify as a scuba diver. At the end of the day, I think so many people get exhausted or even crushed by the pressure of going deep, and they avoid it. And so it's really interesting that 4 of the 5 communication styles are basically on or above surface. That for me was telling, because sometimes I become disappointed with the lack of depth when I'm engaging with folks. And I recently had a session with somebody that does access bars work. I don't know if you've ever heard of access bars, but they do access bars work. And my takeaway from that hour-long conversation was that deep or depth was my game. And I'm looking for it in every engagement or every interaction, which can create some awkwardness around folks who aren't used to that, because we're expecting a level of connection and vulnerability that most people avoid or only have with 1 or 2 people. So Matt, you talked a little bit about listening to learn, but I think there's also a listening to persuade that we need to discuss, because while we won't talk about all of the listening types, I think those 2 are probably the most important ones for this audience.
Yeah. So two things. Number one, this is all part of a process that I call engaged listening. And especially when it comes to listening to persuade, understanding engaged listening is going to be really, really important to lay the foundation here. So there was a Buddhist monk named Thich Nhat Hanh, and he came up with something called engaged Buddhism. And what used to happen in Buddhism is, the monk would just go up on the mountain and they'd never come back down, and they'd reach enlightenment, but they wouldn't share anything with anybody, right? And Tick was like, actually they call him Thay, hey, dude, what is up with these monks, right? Shouldn't we be bringing Buddhism to the world? And I want to bring listening to the world. Engaged listening is a process of the 7 different types of listening, but what it really is the discipline of practice on a daily basis. And in the book specifically, I have exercises at the end of every single solitary chapter so that you can go practice that type of listening. And then what you're going to start to find is the 7 different kinds really are fluid. So let's talk about listening to persuade. So if you're in sales, if you're a leader, or if you're a leader in your own home, listening to persuade is a really, really powerful tool. In fact, it's so powerful, it gets abused a lot. So the story that I share in the book is a huge contrast between 2 people in my life. One of them was my biological father, and the other one's my mom. And I don't know if I've ever said this on a podcast before, but hell, it's in the book. My dad was a shyster. He was a con man. He was an embezzler, actually prosecuted, downright just unbelievably narcissistic and self-centered, diagnosed narcissistic, not like what everybody talks about now. He's a narcissist. No, like this was diagnosed, right? Well, my parents got a divorce when I was 7, because my dad was going to go to jail for embezzling money from the hotel that he worked in. And of course, genetically, I got this listen to persuade gene, right? But my dad would use it to his own benefit. Listening to engage is, and you'll see people do this. I'm sorry, listen to persuade is something that you're going to see over and over again now that you know how to identify it. So you'll be in a restaurant and somebody will sit down and they use the wait staff's name. This is what my father would do, right? And these are, now he did things in a much higher scale, but I'll just give you the practical stuff to illustrate how you can use this power for evil. Or self-centeredness. And so we were at a restaurant, my brother and I, my brother's a couple years older than me. And we're at a restaurant and my dad looks at both of us. I was about 9 at the time. And he said, "Watch this." And, this is my dad. I'm like, okay, I'm freaking going to pay attention, right? Whatever. And so the waitress came over. He used her name. No, I'm sorry. Actually, she didn't have a name tag on. So he asked her, may I ask what your name is? And then she said her name. It was like Marie or something like that. And he immediately made eye contact with her. And he said, "Marie," always using the person's name, "Marie, how are you doing today?" And so Marie, shocked because she's, we're at a busy diner. I think we were in Chicago or we were in Milwaukee. And she just starts talking, right? Because my dad's doing all of the things, leaning in, very gently nodding, microfacial expressions and all of those things, until she realizes, oh my God, I've been talking too long. I'm going to get in trouble. And she said, "Oh my God, I'm so sorry. I need to come back." Apology is the first sign that my dad was about to manipulate this woman, because she didn't do anything wrong. But he made her feel, he knew the situation, because my dad actually ran hotel restaurants, that if she stayed at the table too long, which is what my dad wanted, she could get in trouble from management. So she's like, "Oh my God, I'll be right back. You guys want something to drink?" And she quickly wrote it down and walked away. But as soon as she possibly could, she came back. And my dad then said, he parroted back. This is another huge thing about persuasion. He parroted back what she had said and said, "Marie."
Hey guys, as you might know, a very small percentage of the people who actually listen to this podcast are subscribers. So do us a favor, subscribe. In fact, we did some analytics and we found out that only 25% of the people who listen are subscribers. And our goal is to get that to about 75% over the next 3 months. So do us a favor, hit the subscribe button so you get notified when our new episodes come. We plan to bring immense value to you guys going forward as we continue to improve the content that we create at Dreamcatcher. Your dreams should be real. Let's get back to the show.
I've worked in I've worked in restaurants before. In fact, I've managed restaurants before, and I can see that you are truly a caring and wonderful waitress. And of course, again, compliments are not something that a lot of people get. They get a lot of guff. Um, and he said, so I know that you can do what I'm about to ask. And I also know that your kitchen staff loves challenges, don't they? So, which is not true. Just to be clear, they don't want challenges at all. But what my dad was doing was showing that he was already manipulating this woman, getting her to agree to something that she didn't actually believe was true. Um, so the short part of that story, I'll just finish that up real quick, is he ordered off the menu. He made us order off the menu. We made this woman's life an eternal hell. And then he ended up even getting money taken off the bill, and he didn't tip her. And we got out of the restaurant, and my dad looked at my brother and I and said, do you see what I did there? I'm able to control people and get them to do what I want. And he was so proud of himself. And I remember sitting there, and it made me feel uncomfortable, like something didn't sit right. So the flip side of that is my mother. So my mother worked in nonprofits for most of her life. She ran the American Red Cross here in Kalamazoo, Michigan. And then she ran something called the Hospital Hospitality House. And she used all of those skills for the exact opposite effect. So the hospitality house is like a Ronald McDonald house, is where people stay when they've got loved ones and extended stay in the hospital who are generally not doing well and they can't afford to stay in a hotel the whole time. But man, I used to go see my mom at work, and I remember her sitting in the kitchen with a family, and she did the exact things my father did. Used their names, eye contact, changed proximity distances, lowered her voice tone, raised her voice tone, pace and timbre, all of the things to really truly persuade. But what she was trying to do was, her line of persuasion was making them feel loved, appreciated, comfortable, and taken care of. And so when you're in a sales position or a leadership position, using how these techniques with listening to persuade allows if you're a leader, your team members to feel heard. Because Jerome, you know this, you've worked with unbelievable amounts of business people. The number one reason why people don't like their leaders, because they don't feel freaking listened to, man. And then on top of that, for full transparency, and not to sound self-centered or egotistical, but I've closed about $8 million in revenue for my current company, Proudmouth, by saying very little on sales calls and giving that prospect the feeling of being appreciated, well taken care of, and listened to before they ever become a client.
Man. So one time I heard somebody define manipulation as getting somebody to do something that you want them to do.
Yeah.
And persuasion is getting them to do something that they want to do. It seems like the techniques are the same, they're just tools. But the intent is the thing that determines whether or not you're manipulating or persuading.
Yeah. Yeah.
I, I so I guess there needs to be some type of moral edict that people are participating in before they get the book, because I mean, this literally can teach them how to get people to do things, whether for good or for evil.
Unfortunately, every one of the techniques, dude, can be used that way. I wanted Listen to Persuade. In fact, when I was sitting down with my editor, Derek Pollard, and we were going through and he was helping me write the book, he said, shouldn't this be called Listen to Manipulate, dude? And I was like, well, no, I don't want people to be thinking about manipulation. I want them to think about persuasion, but I want to give the example of manipulation.
Okay. So, what has writing the book taught you?
Well, that's a good question. Um, I still have a lot of work to do. I think that engaged listening is just, it's a never ending journey. It's like a spiritual journey, right? I mean, it is a spiritual journey. That strong desire to make a real deep connection with people is something that I have to practice all the time. But the other thing that it taught me was no matter how great or bad you think the book is, there are a lot of people who just don't know this stuff. And you were one of the advanced readers, one of three, by the way, who got an advanced copy of the book before it was even done, because I trust you so much and I really respect your opinion. And it was so fascinating to me what each of the advanced readers gleaned from the book. Um, and it was really eye-opening to me because, my goal is maybe this, but when you create something like this, you have to be prepared to have it go out in the world and realize that people might not take it the way that you want it. And you said that very clearly a minute ago. I mean, you can use all the powers in this book for your own personal benefit. Absolutely. Or you can use it to fulfill my mission, which is to fundamentally change the world and make people feel less lonely.
So there we get. And I was wondering if we were going to get there. So
Mm-hmm.
loneliness is a problem that you're working on eradicating from the face of the planet. Let's dig into that a little bit because I think it's uncommon for a man to talk about loneliness. I hear many unmarried women in their 40s and 50s and even 60s talk about loneliness, but it's very rare that I hear a man say, "Hey man, I'm lonely," or I miss having somebody to talk to."
Well, I think we have, major issues with what it means to be a man, period. Um, and I think one of the ways to truly be a man is to be in touch with yourself, have more than four emotions, and accept the reality of the world that you live in and be open enough to talk about it. I mean, we don't just have an epidemic loneliness, we have a men suicide epidemic in this country. I mean, it's unbelievable how many men feel so lonely that they don't know who they can talk to, because what we're conditioned to do is to sit around, watch sports on TV, high five people, and talk about the game, when what's really bothering them is the fact that they're having relationship issues. Maybe there's some upbringing issues that they'd really like to talk about, or maybe they want to talk about something other than sports, um, something else that they're passionate about, something else that they could feel a deeper connection with, which, by the way, is why sports are so ubiquitous within the male culture, because it's okay to cry when your sports team loses or have an emotion but you can't have that anywhere else. You can't have that when somebody breaks up with you, or you can't have that when you are feeling lonely. Jerome, I think that, well, it's not that I think, there's been a bunch of research on this. People on social media specifically, what they're doing is they're screaming into this void, hoping that somebody will listen and engage. But the problem is nobody's teaching people how to show that they're listening and engaging. And so it's like this echo chamber, right? Uh, Instead of having real conversation about real issues, men specifically just recede. I'm not going to tell you who I was having breakfast with, but I was having breakfast with a friend of mine a little while ago. And he said to me, I don't have any friends. He said, besides you, and there's reasons why I'm friends with him, but he said, I don't have any friends. He's like, I don't even know how to make friends. And Jerome, that is so common, right? With everybody. And I think one of the biggest issues is there is a level of stubbornness in men specifically that we don't feel we need to change. The world needs to change and bend to our will. And that's just a load of bullshit. You want to have a great relationship with a woman, you have to change. Do you want to have a great relationship with a man? You have to change. You want to have a great relationship with your family? You have to change. The level of stubbornness is really what I think leads to a lot of the loneliness, because they live in these echo chambers that are constantly supporting their own false beliefs of superiority. When you go into engaged listening, you need to realize, and I talk about this in the book, you don't know crap about anything. We talked about that right at the top of the show. And when you have that level of humility and enter into the world with that level of self-reflection and know that you can and should and want to be better, we can change the world.
Woo!
Yeah, that was a little preachy. Sorry about that, dude. I just realized that came across pretty preachy,
I
but
don't know if it's preachy or it's conviction. I mean, the fact of
yeah.
the matter is, most people aren't aware. And you're talking about the patriarchy that kind of poisons the country. And, it's really interesting. I rarely talk about politics, especially in recorded mediums, but to watch what happened with the last election and the
Mhm.
move back to more patriarchy and more dogma and, strength and so on and so forth, which isn't actually strength because there's nothing vulnerable there.
Right.
And so, I mean, there's so many places I can go, but the point that I want the listeners to take away is listening well is directly tied to the level of self awareness that you have. And while we didn't dig deep into it on the show, this book is going to help you get aware about yourself. Matt gives you great opportunities to reflect. The exercises are there to help you get uh, an understanding of who you are, what biases you may have, and how you're actually showing up for other people if you are humble enough to actually spend the time in review. I think a lot of folks feel like they have the answers, and that is unconscious incompetence.
Mm.
This book is something that I believe will be transformational for everybody who reads it because while you may listen, you probably like to talk more than you listen. And in that instance, you aren't learning anything. And I know you're probably smarter than most other people that you interact with, which probably suggests that you're in the wrong room, but that's another story for another day. I think there is a real opportunity for growth. I think there's a real opportunity for healing. And I think there's a real opportunity for a conversation to get started that we've been avoiding because
Mm.
of the implications of having to do something about the things that we hear when we actually spend the time listening. Matt, this is a phenomenal episode to end the Dreamcatchers
Mm.
podcast branding and move into a new space that is really based on listening. And so I just want to thank you for being the epitome of a dream catcher. I want to thank you for having the bravery to step into this space where loneliness is taking over and amplifying and exacerbating more mental illness. It was very interesting to see what happened in COVID and how people adapted and how many didn't. And now that we're on the other side of it, people having a hard time still adjusting and interacting and figuring out what their new normal is. And I think it absolutely has amplified loneliness. And if we don't do something about it, like read your book and then use the skills, tips, and techniques in the book to show up as a better person,
Mm.
our country is in real trouble. And so again, thank you for being a dream catcher. I love ending the show with the question, what's the one thing you want listeners to take away? But I'm not going to ask you that one right now. What I'm going to ask you is, who's the one person that you want to read the book?
Like philosophically or
Philosophically,
like like a category, a niche of people or somebody specifically?
you get to pick. It's the first time we've ever asked this question.
Dude, honestly, and this is talk about shooting for the moon here. Um, I want Oprah Winfrey to read the book. And here's why. I actually reference her in the book. And I am sure that Oprah realizes the power of what she does. Um, but I don't know how many people have really broken it down like I try to in the book about what power she had and power she has in the realm of listening. So I don't know if Oprah's listening to the show, but dude, that'd be really freaking cool to have somebody at that level, that person who is literally the epitome of everything that I teach in this book. She's it. And it'd just be such a flippant honor if she would read it. But that would be shooting for the moon, brother. But this is the last episode of Dreamcatchers, dude. I'm always gonna swing for the fences. So
Yeah. Well, I mean, she had thousands and thousands of opportunities to hone this skill set.
yeah.
So I think the better you are as a host, especially if you've got an interview show, the better listener you are. All right. So now for the final question,
Hmm.
which is, what's the one thing we've covered a ton of ground today? What's the one thing you want the listeners to take away from the show?
Stop listening to respond and learn how to listen to listen. When you're listening to respond, you're missing most of what the person is saying. Um, just shut up. Let the person get done talking, then formulate your question or response. Don't just immediately fill that space. And that's the difference between engaged listening, active listening, and what most of us already do, which is not really listen at all.
Empty listening. So if they want to get the book, where do they go?
Well, they can go to Amazon, literally just type Shut the F Up book. They can do it there, or they can go to matthalloran.com and there's some more information about me, and you can buy the book there.
Wow. And I assume you're going to be doing some keynotes and some other speaking on the backside of this, right?
I am. So, I've already I got a couple of lined up. I actually met with a mentor of mine yesterday who's a phenomenal keynote speaker and who speaks all over the world. And so I have a keynote speech that's based off this book. It's perfect for sales leaders. It's perfect for people in executive positions. And it's really, really good if you're running a conference on relationships for therapists, because I kind of make some things pretty easy and approachable, where a lot of times when you're sitting down with a couples therapist or a couples coach, that they don't, they're way up here. And I try to bring things down to the level. But yeah, I've got some information on my side about that too.
All right. And the takeaway for those who held on long enough, right? My realization with the book was just this understanding of the way that you listen and holding space for folks is the thing that opens up the doors for your ability to be able to persuade. People give you all the answers if you're willing to pay attention, and then you can use those answers in order to help them achieve or accomplish what they want to achieve. um, I think I wrote about it on the back of the book.
You did. It's right here. It's on the back of the book.
All right, to the listeners, your dreams should be real. Thanks again, Matt. We'll talk to you
Thanks,
guys
man.
on the next episode.